Votes on those nominations at 5:30. And on the other side of the Capitol, the House working on partial short-term funding bills that Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid says are a non-starter in the Senate. I want to take you live now to the floor of the House for live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, our stronghold and defense, your judgments and will are perfect, so we place our trust in you. Thank you for the privilege of speaking to you in daily prayer. Forgive us when our prayers are so otherworldly, they are no earthly good. Forgive us also when we put politics ahead of progress. Lord, strengthen our senators today, helping them to not throw away their confidence in you. Inspire them to persevere in seeking to do your will, knowing that your promises are sure and that the harvest is certain. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., October 7, 2013. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Angus S. King, Jr., a senator from the state of Maine, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Following the leader remarks, the Senate being a period of morning business for debate only until 5 p.m. today. And during that period of time, senators will be allowed to speak for 10 minutes each. At 5 o'clock, the Senate will proceed to a vote on the Bruce and Ellis nominations. Both are to be district court judges in the state of Illinois. At 5:30, then, there will be at least one roll call vote on confirmation of the nominations. Mr. President, yesterday, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Boehner, on national TV, claimed there aren't enough votes to pass the only bill that can end this dangerous government shutdown. I believe he's mistaken. 200 members of the House of Representatives who are Democrats have said they would vote for the bill to reopen the government. And 22 Republicans in the House have said publicly that they would vote for the bill. And we've heard there's as many as 100 who want to vote for it. No matter how you do the math, it adds up to a majority of members of the House of Representatives. Now, if there were only a mechanism for polling all members of the House of Representatives to find out whether they support the Senate-passed bill, one surefire way to find out whether the bill would pass is to have a vote on it. That's to vote on the legislation that's already been passed here in the Senate. So there is a way. Have a vote. That would settle the question for a long, long time, wouldn't it? So what I say to the Speaker, allow a vote on the resolution that would end this shutdown, legislation that you, John Boehner, proposed in the first place. The entire federal government could reopen for business by tomorrow morning. So I asked the Speaker, why are you afraid? Are you afraid this measure will pass, the government will reopen, and Americans will realize you took the country hostage for no apparent reason? Why is the Speaker opposed to these reasonable solutions? Mr. President, across the nation, people are suffering, not only federal employees, because of his irresponsible action, the irresponsible Tea Party-driven action, but it's not, I say, only federal employees. U.S. Air had the delivery last Friday of a $180 million aircraft. They couldn't take delivery. Why? Because there weren't inspectors to do that for those aircraft. We know that Lockheed has already announced today they're laying off 3,000 people and more to come. In the defense industry, it's happening all through government. But there's an easy way out of this. Same escape hatch that's been available as long as we've been a country. It's called a vote. But for the 7 days the federal government has been closed for business, the Speaker has refused to use that escape hatch. Mr. President, this is so important. To buy a home, you can't buy an FHA home today. And even those not FHA, you can't get them done because to confirm the amount of money that somebody puts on their application, you need the IRS person to check it. They're not available. The Senate passed a bill to reopen the government while we work out our budget differences. Wasn't my idea. It was his idea. The Speaker of the House of Representatives said, you do this CR at this number, and I will get it done. So we negotiate for a while. I agreed to his number. It was very hard to do for we in the Democratic caucus. But it was his idea, not my idea. All this talk about not negotiating, that's what that was all about. He admits it was his intention all along, to pass a clean resolution. But then he ran into the Tea Party, a minority within my majority that runs the majority over in the House of Representatives. The bill before the House of Representatives is a compromise by us. A compromise that was difficult, I repeat, to get my caucus to accept. Now that we've compromised, the Speaker won't take yes for an answer. He's moved the goal again, though. Last week, he said he wanted to go to conference to work out some differences. As we heard on national TV yesterday, he's not only concerned about Obamacare, he's concerned about budget deficit, as we all are. But he keeps changing. So he said he wanted to talk about that. Fine, we're happy to do that. He wants to talk about Obamacare. He wants to talk about anything else. We'll do it. I put that in writing, had it hand-delivered to him. We said that we would talk about agriculture. We'd talk about health care. We'd talk about domestic discretionary spending, the military spending, anything he wants to talk about. We've been asking to go to conference on a responsible budget for more than 6 months. 6 months. On national TV, the Speaker said, oh, Chairman Ryan and Chairman Murray have been working together for a long time. Well, as I've indicated here previously, he said that in a meeting we had in the White House in the last few days. I said in front of everybody there, it's simply not factual. Senator Murray issued a statement yesterday after she heard him say this on national TV, saying that's not true. They've had a couple meetings, but they haven't discussed anything substantive. I guess the meetings were just to say the Speaker had said they met, but they talked about nothing in her budget or his budget. So we're saying simply reopen the government. We have said we'll go to your budget number. We don't like it. We said we'll go to conference, talk about anything you want. He can't take yes for an answer, Mr. President. Simply reopen the government. We'll talk, I repeat, about anything you want to talk about. We're not afraid to negotiate. We're not afraid to make reasonable compromises. But once again, the football was moved, just like Lucy in the Peanuts cartoon. As Judd Legum, editor-in-chief of Think Progress publication, pointed out, Republicans have a strange definition of compromise. Here's how he explained it. Republicans ask, can I burn down your house? We say no. Republicans ask, how about burning down the second floor? We say no. Republicans ask, how about just the garage? We say no. Republicans say, let's talk about what I can burn down. We say no. And they say, you're not compromising. Republicans insist we must negotiate while the federal government remains closed. As the New York Times editorial reported on Saturday, we know this. 800,000 federal employees are furloughed, government services shut down, and the economy is flagging. It's hardly time for talking. And then, Mr. President, they come up with all this. We'll do an NIH bill. We'll open NIH. The problem is, Mr. President, it's really hard to pick and choose between that and the Park Service, especially when you consider they've cut spending this year for NIH by $1.6 billion. The second year of their famous sequestration, $2 billion. This is all a charade. So here's what the Time wrote after the brief introduction, and I quote, "This is a moment for immediate action to reopen the government's doors, not the beginning of a conversation. Republicans spurned that when they lacked the leverage of a shutdown. Republicans have refused to negotiate over the Senate's budget. They have refused to negotiate over the President's budget. And they've refused to negotiate to make a health law more efficient. The two sides will eventually have to reach a reckoning on long-term economic issues, but the time to do so is not while dangling over an abyss, a cliff. Democrats agree. We're willing to negotiate. We won't negotiate with a gun to our heads. We say to our Republican colleagues, end this irresponsible government shutdown. Stop your reckless threats of a default on the nation's obligations. Then Democrats will negotiate over anything our Republican colleagues want to negotiate."
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Well, we're now in the second week of a government shutdown that nobody claims to want. Democrats say it's unreasonable to ask for any changes or delays to Obamacare. And Republicans, well, we think the Obamacare rollout has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt just how reasonable a delay is. I mean, if anybody had any doubts about the need to delay this thing, those doubts should have been allayed this weekend when the administration admitted its website wasn't working and took it offline for repairs. Delay and basic fairness are what Republicans are asking for at this point, not exactly the sun and the moon. Another thing Republicans have been saying is that we can't agree on a bill to fund, that if we can't agree on a bill to fund the entire government, let's at least pass the most urgent pieces of it. Let's at least pass the parts we can all agree on. And that's exactly what the House has begun to do. Over the past several days, the two parties in the House have responsibly come together and passed no fewer than 8 bills to fund things like the Coast Guard, the Guard and Reserve, and programs for veterans. In other words, the House has quietly shown that the two parties aren't completely at odds in this debate, that there is, in fact, some common ground here. Slowly but surely, the House has approved funding for folks who shouldn't get caught in the middle of a political impasse like this. And they've done it on a bipartisan basis. Over the weekend, the House passed a bill that said a government shutdown doesn't affect the free exercise of religion on a military basis. 184 Democrats agreed. Another bill said government workers shouldn't have to wonder how they're going to pay their bills during a shutdown. 189 Democrats agreed with that. The bill to fund FEMA drew 23 Democrats. The one to fund NIH drew 25. National parks, 23. So let's be clear here that the problem isn't the House. There's actually a fair amount of agreement among Republicans and Democrats over there that lawmakers have a duty and a responsibility that rises above the politics of the moment to fund things like veterans, cancer trials, the National Guard, and reservists in every state. The problem is the Senate. Look, I know Democrats don't like it, but the American people have given us divided government. 2 elections in a row now. They gave us a Republican House, and they gave us a Democratic Senate. That means negotiation isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. And until Senate Democrats accept that reality, these crises will only be harder to resolve. So I would suggest that they start thinking about how they might start playing a constructive role in the crisis and in the challenges that lie ahead. There's a time for politics. There's a time for sitting down like adults and working things out. Republicans are ready and willing to negotiate. We invite Senate Democrats to join us. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 5 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, let me start off by acknowledging an article which appeared in today's New York Times, a tribute to the Senate chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, who led us in prayer to open this Senate session. It's entitled, "Give Us This Day Our Daily Senate Scolding." And it goes on to talk about the prayers which Dr. Black, our Senate chaplain, has offered during the course of the last week in the government shutdown. As they say in the article, the morning invocations turned into a daily conscience check for the 100 men and women of the United States Senate. He said at one point in the course of one of his prayers, Dr. Black said, "Remove from them that stubborn pride which imagines itself to be above and beyond criticism. Forgive them the blunders they have committed." I can't match his baritone voice and delivery when it comes to these prayers, but I ask unanimous consent to enter this article into the congressional record as a tribute to our Senate chaplain who is being given an awesome responsibility to prove the power of prayer in the midst of a government shutdown.
Without objection.
Mr. President, something interesting. I picked up the newspaper, or at least went online to look at the newspapers from Illinois this morning. And 2 stories just jumped right off the page. One was in the Bloomington Panagraph. What a great story it is about how proud I am to be from the Midwest and to represent some people who are just, by their nature, pretty darned extraordinary. It's a story that comes out of Lexington, Illinois. Yesterday, 60 area farmers, truckers and their families gathered north of Lexington on a Sunday morning to go to work, to pay back a friend who had helped them out at one time or another during his 71-year lifetime. 16 combines harvested more than 300 acres of corn as friends of Dave Thomas brought in Thomas' last harvest. Thomas died of a heart attack on July 22nd. His wife Sharon and 4 sons decided to end family farm operations. And he went on to say how it broke the family's heart to give up this family farm. But these neighbors pitched in. They wanted to harvest David Thomas's land and to make sure that last crop was brought in for his family. It is the kind of compassion and caring and family and community which we see in many states, but I see over and over again in my home state of Illinois. It's not unique. It happens often. And every time it does, it's worthy of note because it's such a special comment on the people of this great nation and their caring for their neighbors. The area farmers in Chenoa, not too far from Lexington, are planning a similar harvest operation for another neighbor, Dave Harrison, this morning. Dave passed away last week. Time and again, these farm families put aside their own physical comfort, their own daily schedules, and their own lives to help one another. It just is such a wonderful comment on this great nation that we call home and the area that I'm so proud to represent. The second article that just jumped off the page after I read this came out of Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, and quoted Tim Peterson. He's a wheat farmer. I'm not as familiar with wheat as I am corn and soybeans, but he started talking about the problems he's running into. His problems are created by us. Because you see, Tim doesn't have access to vital agricultural reports. They're casualties of the federal government shutdown. We're stopped publishing this information. And farmers like Tim Peterson and others are forced to make some very important family decisions, some important financial decisions without the necessary information. The reports can alert them to shortfalls in overseas markets or if there's a wide swing in acres planted, both of which might prompt U.S. growers to plant extra crops to meet demands or to hang on to a harvest a little longer to get a better price. Here, these farmers across the Midwest have worked hard to reach this point in the harvest where they can make enough money to live to plant another year, to sustain their families and their communities around them. And they've got a problem. And their problem, the politicians in Washington who want to shut down the government. What a contrast. Farmers who rallied in Lexington, Illinois for the family of a fallen farmer to show that they'd stand by him through thick and thin and help him out, at least his family out, through this adversity. And then this article and story out of Kansas, where the congressmen and senators sent to Washington to do their job and to provide the basic information for these farmers have failed. And in failing, make it much more difficult for these farmers. Two articles in this morning's paper from the central part of the United States of America, which really bring home to me the graphic human side of this government shutdown. Something else brought it home personally, Mr. President. When Harry Reid, our majority leader, announced we weren't going to have votes on Saturday or Sunday, I took the opportunity to get out of town. And I raced off to be with my grandkids. I've got two twin grandchildren, 22 months old, and I just love them to pieces. And I thought getting away with them is exactly what I need to get out of this town and to get my mind straight after a tough political week. We had a ball. We did the normal things you would expect, going to the park and reading Polar Bear, What Do You Hear, and all the things that are just fun for a grandfather. There were a couple moments, though. You see, they're almost 2 years old. And there were a couple moments in the weekend where one of them would lose it for just a little while and start crying and screaming uncontrollably, saying the word no over and over again, unable to express themselves because they just don't have the vocabulary to tell us what's on their mind. And in those moments, I felt like I was back in Washington again. The terrible two temper tantrums sounded like Congress. People shouting no and screaming uncontrollably and unable to express what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that's where we find ourselves today. In the morning talk shows yesterday, on Sunday, a number of leaders came to speak, and of course everybody was focused on Speaker Boehner because he's really the captain of this ship when it comes to the government shutdown. And it was interesting to me that what guided this government shutdown last week, Obamacare, the health care reform bill, they're not talking about so much anymore. It's been launched, and 9 million people across America have visited the websites because they're interested in finding maybe health insurance for the first time in their lives or health insurance they can afford. 9 million. And because so many people have come to these websites, the Republican leader's right. We've had troubles getting them moving forward. It'll take a few days to adjust to this volume of people coming on board to try to find out whether this insurance exchange can help them, their family, their business. The good news for Senator McConnell from Kentucky, my colleague, is that his state has been a real success story. 8,000 people have already signed up in Kentucky for health insurance on the insurance exchange of Obamacare. I hope that Senator McConnell and Senator Rand Paul take some pride in the fact that now 8,000 Kentuckians, at least 8,000, have health insurance they can afford and they can trust, some of them for the first time in their lives. I listen to this and wonder how these senators from Kentucky and some other states can say, we want to repeal this, we want to get rid of this. What are they going to tell those 8,000 people, those families, who finally have health insurance for the first time? Big mistake, sorry. Go back to the marketplace where you have no health insurance protection. That is hardly a response that Americans want to hear in Kentucky, Illinois, in Maine, or any other state. What we're trying to do with Obamacare, the Health Care Reform Act, is to open up an opportunity for 40 to 50 million Americans to have health insurance they can afford for the first time in their lives. And what we've heard from the other side of the aisle is repeal it, defund it, delay it, do anything you can to stop it. Stop it. You know why they want to stop it? Because they understand that once people's appetites are whetted for health care insurance they can afford and insurance where they can protect their families, there's no turning back. We're at a point in history, much as we were with the creation of Social Security and Medicare, where we are offering to families across America something they couldn't do by themselves and something that they will value very, very much as part of their families and their future. And that is what is driving this fear on the other side of the aisle. That's what's driving the government shutdown. Mr. President, what's worse is October 17th, the next deadline. It's not that far away. In another 9 or 10 days, we're going to face a debt ceiling expiration. The debt ceiling is basically America's mortgage. We have to extend our mortgage. We borrow money to manage our government, to fight wars, to pay our military, to do the most basic things. And when we borrow that money, we have to have authorization from the government. That's the debt ceiling. Many of the same senators and congressmen who voted for the spending now will not vote to pay the bill. That's like eating the big meal at the restaurant, and then when the waiter brings the check saying, I ain't paying. Well, how long would that last? That's what many are suggesting when they say we're not going to extend the debt ceiling. They've eaten the meal, they just don't want to pay the bill. It would be the first time in the history of the United States that we would default on our national debt, the first time that we would basically violate the full faith and credit of the United States of America. And it has its consequences. The last time the Tea Party did this, America's credit rating suffered. Well, what happens when our credit rating suffers? The interest rates we pay go up. Taxpayers are paying more to China and countries that loan us money than they're paying to educate children or build roads or do medical research. Well, here we go again. Another threat by the Speaker that we're going to default on our national debt again. They threatened it 2 years ago. They've come back. The Tea Party come back again. This is totally irresponsible. I read the newspapers from different countries, and they look at the United States and shake their head, and they wonder if this, a country which many say, and I can certainly see reason for it, is one of the leaders in the world, can find itself in this manufactured political crisis again and again and again. It's like the temper tantrums of terrible twos when you hear this and think it's totally unnecessary. We've got to help these kids grow up and get through it. America has got to grow up and stand up, say to Congress, it's time for you to grow up and stand up and do the right thing for the future of this country. I hope that we can do this, and I hope we can do it together in a bipartisan fashion. This shutdown of the federal government should end today. The Speaker has before him a continuing resolution which he could pass in a heartbeat, and the government would be extended. The farmer out in Kansas would have the information he needs. The medical researcher would be back at work at the National Institutes of Health. All of the agencies of government would be functioning for the good of the people of America. That's what we were sent here to do. There are no excuses, no political reasons not to. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I want to thank the distinguished senator from Illinois and the distinguished majority whip for bringing up Chaplain Barry Black's name in the article that appeared in the New York Times. I know that Senator Durbin and I do a lot of things together. One of them is every Wednesday morning, or just about every Wednesday morning, we attend the Senate prayer breakfast. And replete through all of Barry's prayers at that breakfast is always one word, and that's humility. And I think the message in that article in the New York Times, the message in the prayers of the last 7 or 8 days in the Senate, and the message to all of us right now is we need to grasp a little humility and find common ground among consternation and move this country forward. And to that end, I want to make my suggestion for what it's worth, and I want to make mine as an inspiration with Senator Collins, the other senator from the state of Maine, who last week made her proposal. If we can't find common ground on the arguments we have today, let's proffer new proposals that give us a chance to solve our problem. Susan Collins made a great suggestion to replace the medical device tax with other revenues so it doesn't cut the revenue, and to get back to sequestration, but only by cutting by the defense agencies, not by cutting across the board. That made a lot of sense. It made a way to absorb those cuts, but do so in a professional way. So I come to the floor today at a Robert Frost moment. You know that poem, Two Roads Diverge in Yellow Wood? I took the one less traveled by, and that made all the difference. We've been traveling down the wrong road for far too long. We're here today in large measure arguing over a CR that we shouldn't have to argue over. Had we been doing our appropriation and doing our budgets over the last 4 years, the money would have been spent, the regular order would have been in place, the fiscal year monies would have been appropriated, and there would be no need for a CR. And there's bipartisan responsibility for not having done a budget or appropriations acts. The leadership obviously controls the floor, so they can bring the appropriations act forward, and that's their responsibility. But we've also cried out on our side for a budget. For year after year, let's have a budget. And now we have a budget, one approved by the House, one approved by the Senate, but an inability to go to conference because we can't get agreement on preconditions. Once again, another situation of not negotiating over something that's important to the American people. So I have a suggestion that 2/3 of this Senate agreed to in the budget debate we had in March, a decision that 20 states have exercised in our country that have made them better, a decision the state of Israel made 2 or 3 years ago when they got in such dire financial conditions and went to the World Bank for suggestions. And that's, let's force our CR and add to it a simple resolution that changes our way of doing business to a biennial budget and appropriations act, where we force ourselves to appropriate over 2 years and not one, and make those appropriations in the odd-numbered years so that in even-numbered years we do only oversight. Would it make a lot of difference for the American people if we were up here arguing not over how much bacon we were bringing home, but how much money we were saving through oversight, savings, and fiscal accountability? I've introduced that legislation along with Senator Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, a governor who ran a state under a biennial budget. It makes sense. It's humble, it's the right way to do business, and it ends this necessity of having continuing resolutions at the last minute because you didn't do our job. Let's face it, we're here today in the conundrum we're in because we did not do our job. We didn't pass a budget and get a conference committee. We didn't have appropriations acts, so we're doing a continuing resolution into a new fiscal year. That's no way to run the greatest country on the face of this earth. 4 years in running, we've shirked our responsibility. It's time for a new day in the Senate. It's time for a biennial budget. It worked for Israel. If it works for 20 states, it will work for us. It establishes priorities. It ends waste, fraud, and abuse. It brings about good decisions. Just last night on 60 Minutes, Senator Tom Coburn from Oklahoma was featured, or the feature was about SSI disability. And the fact that we now pay $135 billion a year in SSI disability payments, a trebling of those costs in just a few years, and fully 25 to 40% we know is fraudulent. 25 to 40% is $40 to $60 billion. You can do a lot with $40 to $60 billion. That's where transparency and oversight works. There's nobody better than the senator from Oklahoma in terms of oversight, and nobody more humble than the senator from Oklahoma. But when he knows he's right, he's going to work hard to do what's right, and that's what all of us should really be doing. Referring to the senator from Oklahoma, I'd go back also to the Workforce Investment Act, which Senator Murray and I are working very hard to bring to the floor. But in that, Senator Coburn found 9 duplicative programs of job training over and over again. We're appropriating money 9 different times to 9 different agencies to do workforce training when we really only ought to be doing one. If we were budgeting on a 2-year basis and doing oversight in even-numbered years, there would be no limit to the successes we can have, the transparency we could enforce, the agreements we could come to, and the lack of cliff management which we're in today. You know, the debt ceiling that faces us in about 10 days is the debt ceiling that faces us because we're having to borrow more money to run our government. We're having to borrow more money to run our government because we're not doing fiscal accountability, we're not doing appropriating, and we're going to continue for that to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. As a businessman and a saver, I know what the time value of money is. The time value of money means if you put away a little bit of money every year and save for your kids' education, for your health care, whatever it might be, when the time comes and you need it, you'll have it. But I also know what the time cost of money is when you're borrowing money to pay off borrowed money. And that's where we are in the United States of America today. So that's why this debt ceiling crisis is such a big issue. I would submit, and humbly, that the Shaheen-Isaacson legislation that forces us to do our regular order business of appropriating, forces us to budget, and forces us to do it every year, puts us back to the kind of discipline and job responsibility we really need around this place. Instead of arguing about what we can't agree upon, we ought to find common ground and run our country's household like America's households run their families. If we had to do here in Washington what every American family has to do year in and year out, this would be a whole lot different place. It's time we found humility, found common ground, did what 20 of the 50 states do what the state of Israel has done, and do what 67 senators said we ought to do in the budget debate back in March, and that's pass a biennial budget and appropriations act and end this foolishness and gain back some of the humility we richly deserve. And, Mr. President, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that I be allowed 2 extra minutes to pay tribute to a physician in my county.
Without objection.
And I'd like for it to appear separate in the record, if you don't mind, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Mr. President, you and I had a discussion, interestingly enough, at the prayer breakfast 2 weeks ago about skin cancer. And we shared a common responsibility or common experience, and we had confronted a melanoma at one time in our lives. Well, on this Friday night, Dr. Clem Doxey of Marietta, Georgia, retiring after 43 years as a leading dermatologist in the Southeast, Chief of Staff at Kennesaw Hospital, and also a leading dermatologist around the United States of America. A real inspiration to me. A man who led me to help pass the TAN Act along with Senator Reid and others, and John McCain, who came together to bring about awareness for skin cancer, awareness for melanoma, awareness for early detection. A citizen that contributed to us an idea that's now the law of the land in the United States of America, and one I'm sure that will help to save lives. Clem's retiring after many, many years in Marietta, Georgia, and 43 years in practice. He's been a leader in Rotary, leader in the citizens organizations in our community, a leader in our hospital, and a friend to me and my dermatologist. He graduated from the Pensacola School of Medicine and went straight as a flight surgeon to Vietnam in the United States Marine Corps. He returned to be a physician and get his residency training at Tulane University Medical Center in New Orleans, Louisiana, and then came to Marietta, Georgia, and founded Marietta Dermatology, the leading dermatology practice now in the state of Georgia. He retires this Friday night, but I walk around on these 2 feet in part because Clem taught me early awareness, early identification, and the right practices to deal with skin cancer. I thank him on the floor of the Senate for what he did for me and what he's done for countless patients over countless years in the great city of Marietta and the great county of Cobb. And, Mr. President, I yield back the balance of my time. And note the absent, no, I take that back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the Senator from Georgia for his call on this place to get back to regular order and to bridge our differences. I think it's an important one and a noble and hopefully easy request for us to ultimately follow. Mr. President, I came down here this weekend to talk about a young woman in Bridgeport, Connecticut, who is at the epicenter of the fallout of this shutdown. And I wanted to come back down here on Monday to just tell her story very briefly once again. Because, you know, the way that a lot of trade papers down here cover this shutdown, it makes it seem as if this is just about politics. And if you listen to some commentators and some members of the Tea Party crowd in the House of Representatives, they'll tell you that what you're going to find in this shutdown is that everybody's going to learn the government really doesn't do that much, and it's not that big a deal if it goes away for a couple months, a couple weeks, a couple days. What we're finding as we enter week 2 of the shutdown is that we have now moved past the point where the collapse of the government is just an inconvenience. It is now ruining lives. And I wish that Melanie Rhodes was the exception, but she is increasingly becoming the rule across the country. Mr. President, you heard me tell her story this weekend, but I'm going to do it again. Melanie was homeless a couple of years ago. She lives in the southwestern portion of Connecticut. She had hit really hard times, but she decided to pull her life together, not least of the reasons being that she had a little boy. She had a son, Malachi, and Malachi was born about 2 months premature, and so he was born with some developmental disabilities that luckily, because of a government program, they caught early on, a program called Birth to 3. In Connecticut, it's our early intervention program. Most states have it. One of the programs that is going to run out of funds pretty soon if we don't start turning back on the faucet to state governments. But even more important to Melanie was that through that early intervention screening program that figured out that Malachi needed a little bit of extra help, they got him into a Head Start program. He wasn't even 1 year old when he started the Head Start program. Today he's 3, and he's making incredible progress. he's got some serious issues. He's just learning how to communicate now with some signs that he's been taught, but he's doing better and doing better every single day. On Monday night of last week, Melanie stayed up all night watching as to whether the government was still going to be operating, because she knew that the Bridgeport Head Start program works on a fiscal year that matches ours. So if the government shut down on October 1st, well, then the check wouldn't come to Bridgeport Head Start, and they would have to send 1,000 kids home. But she also knew that her life was starting to get brighter in other ways as well. She had been looking for a job for a long time, and she had done everything we asked of her. She had applied to everybody she could think of, from Walmart to Walgreens to McDonald's, and she hadn't found anything until a bus company decided to hire her as a driver. And she'd gone through her training. She was just waiting for her background check to come back. It was going to be okay, and she was going to start work. But, of course, the only way she could start work is if she had care for her child. And as she has said so eloquently over the past week, she can't just leave Malachi with anybody because he's a kid with substantial difficulties, and his caregivers need to know how to take care of him. So if there's no Head Start, there's no school for Malachi. He regresses in terms of the progress that he's made, and she can't start her job. Her family essentially collapses around her, simply because this place can't pass a budget. That's what's happening to Melanie Rhodes. And she says simply this: we need our government and our businesses open. Why should we suffer and be held hostage while government can't do what they need to do? Her story can be repeated thousands of times across Connecticut. I think I saw today that about 18,000 Head Start slots are going to be closed by the end of this week. Unfortunately, her story is not the exception. It's becoming the rule. This is what this shutdown means. It's not play acting. It's real. And as I watched some of the shows over the weekend, I heard a familiar refrain from our Republican colleagues. They said, you know what, yeah, we have this demand that we want the health care law delayed or repealed or defunded in order to get the government up and operating, but really it's the Democrats, it's Harry Reid, it's President Obama who won't sit down and negotiate. If they just sit down and negotiate, then we could end this whole thing. And I understand how some people might watch that claim and think to themselves, well, yeah, well, wait a second, why won't the Democrats just sit down and talk about this? And so, Mr. President, I just want to address this claim that the only thing stopping us from opening back up government is that the Democrats won't talk to the Republicans. I want to address that in 5 simple ways. First, I want to make the point that virtually every single one of my colleagues has made. We've already talked, because what we thought we were talking about was a continuing resolution, a temporary budget that would keep the government operating for about 6 weeks. And a lot of Democratic critics actually would argue that we didn't really negotiate that well over that particular issue, because in the end, the Senate passed a budget with a particular number for the continuing resolution. The House passed a budget with a particular number for the continuing resolution. The difference was pretty substantial, and in the end, the Senate just decided to go with the House number. We didn't settle in between. We didn't settle closer to ours or closer to theirs. We just took the House number. And so we kind of feel like on the subject at hand, which is the continuing resolution, the negotiation has already happened, and we gave the House everything they wanted. There's not much more to negotiate after you give them everything when it comes to the bottom line number in the continuing resolution. Second, it's kind of hard to have a negotiation when only one side is making demands. We don't have any demands in this negotiation. All we want is for the things that normally happen to continue to happen, i.e., we want the government to stay open on the exact same terms that the government was open last week and the week before. We want the country to pay our bills just like we have paid our bills for a generation. It is only Republicans, and frankly not all Republicans, most frankly of the Republicans in the Senate are not making these demands. It's mainly a small handful in the House and the Senate who say that in order to keep the government open, we want health care, the health care law defunded or repealed or delayed. It's difficult to have a negotiation when all we want is the status quo. It's kind of like if two people lived in a house and one of them said, you know what, I'm going to take the roof off the house if you don't do what I want. You wouldn't really negotiate that. That's an unreasonable demand. The roof just needs to be there. It's something that, for good reason, is normally not the subject of debate or negotiation. And you wouldn't settle for half. You wouldn't allow your roommate to take half the roof off or three-quarters of the roof off. The roof just needs to be there. And if you're angry at me about something or you want to talk about something, let's do it while the roof is still on top of us. We can't negotiate over the government just operating. We can't negotiate over whether or not we're going to pay our bills. We don't want anything. We just want things to happen as they have happened in the past. Third, this place just can't operate if in order to keep the government open for 6 weeks, we have to satisfy everybody's personal political agendas. Mr. President, I also said this week, and I have things that I feel really strongly about. I represent Sandy Hook, Connecticut. I would submit that I feel just as strongly about background checks as a senator from Texas does about repeal of the health care bill. But it would be unreasonable for me to say that I'm not going to vote for a budget just because I don't get my way on background checks or immigration reform or tax fairness or whatever it may be that I care about outside the confines of the continuing resolution. If all 100 senators had to get their particular non-budgetary political point settled as a requirement of passing a continuing resolution, this place would just absolutely collapse. Now, maybe that's what some people want. Maybe some people want government to collapse and the government to shut down. But when I hear people talk on this floor, I take them at face value that that's not what they want. Ultimately, we all can't get what we need all the time. Fourth, you normally need to compromise when you don't have consensus, when you don't have agreement, when both the Senate and the House don't have the majority of their members agreeing to the exact same thing. In that case, you need to negotiate because clearly we don't have consensus, and so we have to get two sides together to find consensus. We have consensus. We have a bill that the majority of senators support, the majority of House members support. The President is ready to sign the minute that it gets to his desk. That is what is referred to as a clean continuing resolution, a bill that would just keep the government operating for the next 6 weeks on the same terms it was operating beforehand. The only reason why that is not law today is because Speaker Boehner will not bring that up for a vote in the House of Representatives, but it reportedly enjoys the support of more than 216 members of the House, which is what you need today to get that bill passed, and it has already passed the Senate. And lastly, as Senator Durbin talked about, what Republicans are demanding as their condition to keep the government up and operating is no less than the repeal of the signature achievement of President Obama's first term. The most important bill that I have ever worked on, the most important vote that I have ever cast. That is the health care law, which is today saving millions of dollars for senior citizens in their Medicare benefit, and right now is providing a lifeline to millions of Americans who need cheaper insurance. It's why poll after poll tells you that, although people are still split on whether they agree with the exact prescription for our health care economy laid out in the bill that we passed, they sure as heck don't want us to repeal the law. By about a 2-to-1 margin, people say, no, don't repeal the law, let it go into effect, give it a shot. It's also why, by a 3-to-1 margin, people don't agree with shutting down the government over the repeal of the health care law. It's why 9 million people have gone on to the federal health care reform website to see what their options are. It's why, as Senator Durbin said, even in states like Kentucky, people are signing up by the thousands. In the first day of Connecticut's exchange, we had more visits to the website than we had in the entire month previous. People are desperate for lower-cost health care out there. Sick people and families with sick children have been waiting lifetimes to finally be able to get insurance for their loved ones. People need this health care reform law to go into effect, and it is simply not true, as a senator from Texas and others have said, that people don't want this law. They have showed us how badly and how desperately they need it by the flood of interest in the exchanges over the first week, and in poll after poll, the American people say loudly they don't want this thing repealed. It's hard to get major social change passed in this town. The Founding Fathers intentionally set up a process by which something like health care reform seems nearly impossible. That's why it took 100 years since Teddy Roosevelt first proposed that we guarantee access to our health care system to all Americans for it to happen. Because you got a lot of chances for that idea to crater. You need both chambers to pass the exact same bill. You need a president willing to sign it. You need the courts to uphold it. And then you need the electorate to confirm it when everybody that voted for it stands for re-election again. The reason why we are implementing the health care law today, and the reason why most Americans want it to go forward, is because we passed every single one of those tests. For the first time in 100 years, the exact same proposal to reform our nation's health care system passed with a majority of both the House and the Senate, was signed by a president. The Supreme Court reviewed the law and stamped that it was constitutional. And then this president and every member of the Senate that voted for the health care bill went out to stand for re-election in 2012 based on the promise that they would continue to implement the law. The president was re-elected by a resounding margin, and every senator in this chamber who voted for the health care law won re-election. Bill passed, courts upheld it, voters confirmed their original choices. People want this law. We already compromised on the amount in the continuing resolution. It can't be much of a negotiation when all we want is for the government to stay up and operating and for us to pay our bills. This place can't work if every time you negotiate a budget, everybody has to have their own political priorities taken care of. We don't need to negotiate because we already have a bill that enjoys the support of both chambers and will be signed by the president if only the House of Representatives would call it for a vote. And the idea that people don't want the health care law simply is not borne out, either by the polls or by people's conduct on the exchanges over the last 2 weeks. Melanie Rhodes is waiting for an answer from us, Mr. President. Malachi needs to get back into preschool, ASAP. He's a little autistic boy who every single day he sits home by himself is marching a little bit more quickly backwards off of the progress that this program funded, not by government, but by all of us, because we thought it was important that little boys with autism growing up in poor families with moms that used to be homeless should have a chance at success in life. Every day that we continue to reverse our collective decision as a society that Malachi should get some help, he goes backward and backward and backward. And his mom, who we said, you know what, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, do the right thing for yourself and your child, she did it. She got him into Head Start. She went out and found a job. And now, because that program is shut down, she likely won't be able to start her job. He moves backwards. She moves backwards. And is not because Democrats won't negotiate. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
I first of all want to thank my colleague from Connecticut for those eloquent and very powerful remarks and take advantage of his presence here to perhaps engage in a colloquy, if he's agreeable to doing so, asking him, because he spoke so wonderfully about that one family, whether he has seen, as I have seen, that story of deprivation and setback duplicated on a bigger scale throughout our state.
I thank my colleague from Connecticut for the question. As you know, there are 1,000 different children just in that one Head Start program alone who have essentially lost access to child care. This week, I think the number is, as you know, about 18,000 kids across the country who will lose access to health care. As we've seen, it has already had a big effect in our state because we have so many defense manufacturers. Some of the initial furloughs to civilians have caused for a loss of work amongst families that couldn't afford it. We are seeing over and over and over again how this shutdown trickles down and is frankly affecting the very families who can't afford to miss a paycheck, the very families who can't just make quick arrangements to find somebody else to take care of their autistic child. As the Senator has seen and knows, this is affecting in our small state thousands and thousands of residents who just didn't have a lot of wiggle room when it came to the support that were standing around them due to programs run by the federal government.
And in fact, I think the statistics show that more than 1,000 children are directly affected and their families by this shutdown in Head Start alone, and seniors in terms of nutritional assistance. I don't know whether my good friend and very distinguished colleague from Connecticut has seen that phenomenon as well in Bridgeport and throughout our state of Connecticut and would care to remark on it.
Well, and I would just say this to the Senator. We've had this effort on behalf of Republicans to kind of pick and choose which parts of the government that they are going to reopen. And as I noted here on the floor in objecting to one of these piecemeal requests, that exact program that you refer to, senior nutrition programs, which provide meals to very low income and often very frail seniors who are getting them either at a senior center or delivered to them through the Meals on Wheels program, was not initially one of the programs that Republicans chose to reopen. And so that's why we object to this piecemeal approach, because it's just bad policy to allow for a wing of this House or the other House to pick and choose which people they help, leaving on the outside, as you mentioned, some who are very deserving, like very frail and often very hungry senior citizens.
And what's needed, I think my colleague would agree, is really an end to the shutdown, reopening government, not for the sake of reopening the government, but to provide these vital services, and assurance that the United States of America, the greatest nation in the history of the world, is going to continue paying its debts. And then, and only then, a conference and a compromise and collaboration on what our overall budget should be, with smart spending cuts and increases in revenue that close some of the loopholes and subsidies. And I think that was the thrust, was it not, of what my colleague from Connecticut had to say.
I think the Senator, our majority leader, has been very clear that he's willing to sit down and talk about anything and everything that Republicans want to discuss, but not with a gun to our heads. Let's reopen the government, and then, as we have been willing to as a chamber over and over again, let's sit down in a budget conference with everything that is part of that budget on the table. But, you know, this just can't happen every time that one faction of one House doesn't get their way. They shut down the government until their particular demands are remediated. As I was saying, you and I, Senator Blumenthal, care deeply about the issue of background checks. You've worked your entire life on this issue, but given your life's work, you're still not coming to this chamber and demanding that until you get your way on that issue, which is of such vital importance to your constituents as mine, that you'll shut down the government.
And in fact, what's happening is that a small fraction of one house of the Congress, in fact, the House of Representatives, one small group of right-wing extremists, whatever they may characterize themselves as, is holding hostage the entire House of Representatives, the entire Congress, the entire government, even though it's only one branch and one part of a branch. And I think that Senator Murphy has really explained well our view, and our constituents in Connecticut need to know it, that we're willing to compromise and collaborate, but not with hostage-taking tactics that in effect say to everyone else in the country, it's our way or the highway. And I want to thank my colleague from Connecticut for speaking so clearly and persuasively on this topic and for giving the impact of this government shutdown a human face and a human voice. The story that he told from Bridgeport has indeed thousands of others just like it across the state of Connecticut, across the country, who are suffering the real hardship and harm of this shutdown. We can talk in the abstract here. Our rhetoric may carry a little bit beyond these four walls, but the real-life consequences belong to them. And both Senator Murphy and I have seen them in real life. And that's why we're here, to advocate and fight for those people of Connecticut, in Bridgeport, those families who depend on Head Start, those seniors who depend on nutritional assistance, and tell their story as he has done so well today in this chamber. And tell the story also about the Sikorsky workers, men and women, and their families. They do great work for our nation. On their assembly lines, Black Hawk helicopters are made the best in the nation. They perform rescue operations for our troops in Afghanistan. They medevac our nation's warriors to places where they can be saved. They provide resupply and provisions. They are literally life-saving vehicles in our war to keep America safe. And those workers in Sikorsky were told late last week, you're done. You're furloughed. You're not reporting to work next week because 45 inspectors, civilian employees of the United States Department of Defense, are going to be furloughed. 45 inspectors and 1,500 or 2,000 or more workers at Sikorsky on the Black Hawk helicopter line and other essential product assembly told they were going to be furloughed. Senator Murphy and I and other members of our delegation spoke with officials of the Department of Defense and made clear to them our interpretation of recently passed law, that it would apply to employees of the Defense Contract Management Agency whose services were vital to certify and inspect those helicopters, keep open the assembly lines of Sikorsky, and make sure that Black Hawks were continuing to be available to our military men and women who depend on them so vitally. Those conversations, and I'm sure others had them as well, with officials of the Department of Defense, along with the action of the House over the weekend to make sure that clearly all our furloughed employees of the United States government will be paid eventually, persuaded Secretary Hagel to do the right thing. And I want to commend Secretary Hagel and thank him for bringing back those employees, like the 45 DCMA inspectors, who have to be there for the Department of Defense to take delivery of those helicopters, which in turn is necessary to keep open the assembly line and keep employed and on the job those Sikorsky workers and countless of hardworking men and women at defense contractors across the United States. I thank Secretary Hagel, but at the same time, we need to recognize that for every Sikorsky, for every Fortune 500 corporation, for every one of those big defense contractors, there are literally thousands of suppliers and small businesses who are continuing in uncertainty and sometimes confusion about what is happening here in Washington. Thousands of other businesses that depend on those suppliers because they provide the raw materials that the suppliers use to turn into the parts for the Sikorsky helicopters. The ripple effects, the ramifications pervade our economy and our society. The uncertainty creates harm and hardship that is immeasurable and perhaps irreparable. The harm is not only to those workers who rightly had the whiplash of being furloughed one day and being called back another and being uncertain as to what the impact ultimately on their lives this shutdown would have, but on the suppliers and the countless other small businesses who cannot plan, cannot look ahead, cannot hire for the future, and sometimes have to tell their workers, you're going to be on furlough. You can't plan to buy a car or a new home or even the most minor things like school supplies or maybe other plans. Lives are in the balance. Lives are at stake. The real-life consequences are real and perhaps lasting for many Americans, not only the family who depends on Head Start or on senior nutrition assistance or on a job in Sikorsky, but the countless others whose lives are also in the balance. And there is a solution to this impasse. Calmer minds, cooler heads, common sense are beginning to reach a consensus that the House should be given a chance to vote, that the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Boehner, should enable that vote. Very simply, provide an opportunity to Republicans and Democrats, not singling out one side or another, but simply enabling them to come together on a bipartisan basis. Who cares who's in the minority of that vote if it reopens the government to provide Head Start and nutritional assistance and enable some certainty that permits our economy to move forward rationally and sensibly, to recover from the Great Recession, to grow jobs, and enable the economy to reach some measure of prosperity. We all have an interest in that outcome. We all should be pulling for America. We all should assure that the greatest nation in the history of the world will leave no doubt that it will pay its bills on time, that it will fulfill its obligations on time, just as we have for every year in the history of this great nation. There is a way to come together. I hear from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that the time has come to end this impasse if we simply let the House vote. Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence